folks. I'm so glad that you're all here with us, and I hope that you and yours are all doing as well as possible during these continually sideways times. I wanted to start by saying that, as we are all very well aware in African studies, colonialism is an ongoing process. As a program, we recognize and respect the knowledge reflected in the Ho-Chunk's custodianship of Diop, otherwise known as Madison, and in their continuing connection to land, water, and community at UW-Madison. We recognize the violence, displacement, and settlement that shape our relations in and with this space. I'm so sorry. And we must, therefore, as a community committed to justice, commit ourselves to addressing the intentional erasure of Indigenous people in our policies, our practices, our teaching and our learning, and in our relations to place with this institution and with the earth. We encourage all members of the African Studies program and UW-Madison to trace, celebrate, and deepen their own connections to Diop, and to learn about the histories and present stories of the resilient Ho-Chunk presence and relationships that shape Diop. Learning about Wisconsin First Nations is an essential, although only partial step in this process, and I'm including some first points in that process in the chat in case any of you are interested. With that, I want to, I'm so excited about today's speaker. I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Yeukai Mlambo, for coming and joining us today. Angelo, not sorry. She is the director of the Mastercard Foundation Digital Initiatives at Arizona State University and an assistant research professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. In her administrative role, she leads the Baobab platform, which is a Mastercard Foundation funded digital alumni engagement and social learning platform for African youth. As a scholar, her research centers on addressing higher education leadership representation through broadening access, inclusion, and equity for underrepresented groups in higher ed. In particular, her work focuses on issues related to the recruitment, retention, persistence, and trajectories of underrepresented populations in STEM fields. More broadly, her interests include higher education institutions and faculty development in sub-Saharan Africa and across the quote-unquote developing world, women in higher education leadership, international student experiences, and the role of higher education partnerships in institutional development. Her work relies on critical frameworks which center the experiences of marginalized groups, attend to history when interrogating phenomena, and advocate for social change. Yeukai holds a PhD in higher adult and lifelong education from Michigan State University, and we are so delighted and honored to have her with us today. Yeukai, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to share my screen. Get this started. All right. Can everybody hear me? I will assume yes. So, all right, thank you, Nancy, for that introduction. I also really appreciate that you acknowledge the land where Madison lies, because I think that is important in decolonizing process of what I'm going to be talking about today a little bit. So as Nancy already mentioned, in my current capacity, I lead 2 grant-funded programs that are Africa-focused. I enjoy that work for a number of reasons, but mainly because they're Africa-facing. They allow me to connect with the continent and the people, especially the young people. They also provide an opportunity for me to support the relationship between 2 geolocations that I'm going to forever be intertwined with, right? So Africa is where home is, and then North America is where I've been educated. And so my main drivers in the work I do are centered around ensuring in that work that Africa and African voices are amplified in any space that I'm in, which includes also sometimes challenging and correcting deficit narratives about the continent. So while I may not call myself an African studies disciplinary scholar per se, by virtue of the work that I do that engages with Africa and centers Africa, I would like to call myself a backdoor African studies scholar in that sense. So just to go into some of my talk today, my post-colonial awakening is a little bit new, maybe about 7 years. I was always drawn to these post-structural perspectives to start off with this notion that to understand an object, one has to study the system in which that object was produced or created. So that's very Foucault for those who are philosophers, this notion that power and knowledge are interconnected and can be used to shape and to control society. So in essence, if you understand the system and how it operates, then you can understand what narratives have been created that then resulted in a particular object being to be known in a certain way. While I was thinking through post-structuralism, I was also drawn to a few of the Marxist ideas about telling the story from the margins. In particular, I use a lot of Sandor Harding's work, at least very much in my early career, and standpoint theory, which drew me to this idea that to truly know how power operates in society, you need to listen to the voices at the margins of that society. The idea then that those at the margins tend to have a deeper understanding of the hierarchies and inequities in a society because they themselves at the bottom tend to experience what the absence of power means. And so with using these ideas, I use this a lot in my early work to theorize on and with African women in South Africa in particular. And so through reading some of this Marxist work with Sandor Harding, my readings around feminist perspectives and critical theories then led me to Spivak, which is about 7 years ago. And I do credit my professor from Michigan State, Dr. Riyad Shahjahan, who continued to sort of bring some of these readings into the space that I was in. And Spivak really talks about this concept of the subaltern. And there's a whole post-colonial literary landscape that kind of engages with some of these conversations. At the core, Spivak says, those at the margins, those subalterns, they want to speak, but they're often not provided the space or the allowance to do so by the knowledge elites. And in this case, the knowledge elites in themselves will not provide that space because it is in their ability to write about and on behalf of the subaltern that their own identities are created and maintained as superior. So in all of these perspectives, thinking through post-structuralism, Marxist perspectives, and then the post-colonial theories, the connections between knowledge, power, and positionality are repeating themes. An interesting thing too then that happened was, as I was reading Spivak, I kind of went back and re-engaged with African writers to start to see them in a new way. Seeing them not just as storytellers who were bringing to life my favorite characters in books like Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe or Ngugi's I Will Marry When I Want. But I started to see them more as philosophers, knowledge producers, and critical scholars in their own rights who recognize the power of language and the pen, and through those novels who are writing their resistance to Western imperialism. So beyond that, that re-engagement then triggered a question for myself. Why up until now have I not viewed African writers themselves as anything other than philosophers, right? And my education, I think, was the core answer, is that in studying philosophy in undergrad in university, while I was exposed to Foucault, Derrida, and all those sort of contemporary European philosophers, there was never a deliberate attempt to include African philosophers in there. So the notion of moving away from a very Western perspective was absent because the narrative was these Western philosophers were the bedrock of modern philosophy, right? To know them is to know all you need to know, essentially. And so as I was re-engaging with the work of African scholars and African writers, I started to think about how I myself can be part of the project of reclaiming African narratives in my own work. So enters the NorthSouth Partnership as one component that I'm going to just focus on today. So in the work that I've done, while I approached it very much so with this notion of it can be a post-colonial project, there's the ethics of post-colonial notions in my mind, I quickly realized too that there is a double-edged sword component to North-South partnerships. So on one hand, they do provide that opportunity for mutual understanding, for resource sharing, and also when done well, they provide an opportunity to demystify and reshape previously held deficit narratives about the global South. But in the same interactions, if they're not managed well, there also lie these performances, systems, processes that tend to perpetuate actually the global hierarchies and then reinforce unequal dependencies that tend to then be counterproductive to the liberation activities that Southern partners are often, at least in the post-colonial term, would be striving for or have strived for, right? So engaging in any North-South partnership, for myself, whether at the institutional level or at the individual level, the thing that tends to show up very fast and almost consistently is this deference to Northern leadership. And it's quickly then moves into this definition of a giver-receiver hierarchy, where the Southern partner is rarely, if ever, the giving party. And the structure of the partnerships themselves then rooted in development from the onset tend to paint the picture that the developed countries have reached this sort of pinnacle on the hierarchy of development, where they're now well positioned to support the developing South to then essentially come up to their level. And development then, of course, is defined in economic terms, right? And the superiority of knowledge systems. But in all of these engagements, there's very rarely, if ever, kind of to the way that Nancy started this conversation of acknowledging, colonialism and all the things that have happened in different spaces. None of these engagements take into account how the wealth and power and knowledge in quotation marks, achieved by the North actually came through an engagement of violence with the colonies in the South. And very rarely at all, more so, is there a sentiment that the Northern partners themselves are also evolving, are also growing, can also learn, can also themselves develop further. Or that Southern partners themselves are knowledge producers or holders of knowledge that the Northern partner specifically can also learn from. But add to that, what is most damaging, I think, is when the Southern partners themselves cannot see themselves as knowledge creators either. And so in looking through some of the post-colonial work, Ngugi in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, discusses how such tensions can occur. In essence, he argues that language is culture. And through language, images are created that guide a child to see the world in a certain way. And so for Ngugi, the colonial child was made to see the world and where they stand in it as defined or as essentially reflected and written into existence by the language of imposition. So basically by the global South, global North. And so he goes on to say, and I quote, "It was worse when the colonial child was exposed to images of his world as mirrored in the written languages of his colonizer, where his own native languages were associated in his impressionable mind with low status, humiliation, corporal punishment, slow-footed intelligence and ability, or downright stupidity." Harsh words, but he goes on to sort of describe other more, demeaning ways that literature or writing has tended to frame the global South, especially when written by the global North. So for Ngugi, these images and perspectives, when then internalized, can impact and influence one's cultural and political choices, and essentially how they navigate relationships with others, especially Northern partners. And I would add to here that it influences how we as Southern partners or Southern individuals see ourselves in the knowledge economy, reinforcing, of course, the narrative that those in the South are only consumers of knowledge, not creators. And then this then allows the Northern systems and actors to continue to produce knowledge and to speak on our behalf. This notion of speaking on the behalf of and kind of holding this space of I then get to continue to write for you because you yourself are not capable or willing, I suppose. Achille Mbembe calls it anthropological knowledge, which is a process of knowing about others but a process in itself that never fully acknowledges that these others themselves are also thinking and knowledge producing subjects. So in thinking through all the ways that colonization, colonialism, framing of what history and writing has been, post-colonial approaches actually provide an opportunity to reveal these power dynamics about who gets to write history, who gets to represent other people, who gets to represent places. And it recognizes then too that currently and historically, this power overwhelmingly resides in the West or global North with descendants of European colonizers. But that at the same time, post-colonial approaches also allow for a counter story to be told, so that the history of events, interventions, actions within the global South and in relation to the global North can be redefined by the different actors who have participated in it or who have been impacted by it. So it's within this context of understanding, right, that power dynamics exist and there's an opportunity to provide counter stories that a lot of my work centers around. And there are two elements that run through all of it, and Nancy mentioned it in her introduction at the beginning. First, that history is important, and in this case, the history of colonization, which serves for me as a marker for understanding phenomena. Note, though, that it doesn't define it for me, but it does provide me an integral understanding to global relationships as they stand today. The second is that there is a need to reclaim our own stories. Those stories throughout time that have been written about us, not by us, reclaiming now in our present stories that reflect our own histories, our own beginnings, which began before colonization, and then that will continue to go beyond what I call the trauma of colonization. So history is important because it does two things. First, it exposes that legacy of colonization, how the legacy is institutionalized and influences essentially every. Second, it helps us to confront and make sense of the present. Specifically, it helps us as Africans who have been socialized to compare ourselves with the Western others so often, understand that the blame doesn't fall on us. So we hopefully can begin to judge ourselves less harshly. Essentially, history reminds us that our status as the global South in the knowledge economy is not of our making, but it is because we were robbed, right? Robbed of our resources, of our people, of our knowledge, which then did not allow us to develop, quote unquote, at the same pace as others because of the suppression that was happening. Mamdani calls for this change in framing from one where Africa is judged not in comparison to the Western other, but as the continent that is engaging with the trauma of colonization. And he writes, writing on Africa has been largely an exercise in explaining what has gone wrong. To talk of Africans as having failed only makes sense in analogy with European history. It makes better sense to look at post-colonial experience not as an attempt to catch up with history, but to come to terms with the colonial legacy. And it is this trauma of colonization that tends to be imposed on us, but also one we have been trained to carry. And so by us carrying it, these wheels of imperial thinking that paint Africa as in need of Western intervention, in need of Western spokespersons, in need of Western saviors, then continues to be perpetuated. While it goes without saying, my personal stance is that knowledge about and on Africa should be owned and guided by African people. But the reality is that there are few African studies journals created, edited, and funded or owned fully by Africans. When African studies related articles are published, because of the nature of our higher education systems that reward Western publications over local or regional ones, essentially for promotion, they tend to then be in Western journals. And then also the funders of the projects tend to also be from the West, and they fund initiatives that they deem important, sometimes or often disregarding the needs identified by local communities, or in some cases, defining through their funding what should be important. You can just think through the IMF and the structural adjustment programs and what that did for higher education in Africa. So as a result, the knowledge production and dissemination power remains in the West. And also then those who engage in development work or who are focused on Africa, those who are based in the West, and then sometimes Africans themselves, us who are educated in Western educational systems, then tend to hold, carry, and reinforce these very same deficit perspectives and proceed to initiate and implement similarly unequal engagements or partnerships when we're engaging with the Global South. When just thinking about the funding conversation, I found a very interesting quote by Nigerian scholar Jay Fo, who shares, non-Africans can get money to do what Africans often could do better, yet the Africans must sit and watch it. I will add to it, or worse, be taught, dismissed, challenged, corrected when they dare advise on African-related issues in a manner that is not the same way of thinking that was at the table. So in North-South partnerships, if the ideal goal is mutuality and reciprocity, in an article that I wrote with my colleague Erin Baxter, and Diana can share it after we're done, we end by providing some post-colonial considerations for engaging in North-South partnerships. One key strategy that continues to be what we amplify is this prefacing any partnership engagement with an understanding that everyone involved is there to learn. So creating a culture of learning or perception of learning or co-learning. And we engage in the idea of this creating a space for learning using this notion of the third space. And this comes from post-colonial scholar Homi Bhabha, who uses it as a way to refer to a new paradigm of thinking or creation of a new paradigm of thinking in the process of decolonizing. And he asserts then that cultures of the colonized and the colonized are constantly interacting and transforming each other. And so that interaction gives way to a new culture, what he essentially calls a third space. And it is in this third space where there is potential for diverse knowledges to all be valued, for new understandings and appreciation for differences to take place. And in our article, we also argue that this is where learning could take place for all parties involved, provided there is that coming into it with an openness to learn. Ultimately, a third space is necessary because any other space currently that exists, right, is tainted or has been touched by this legacy of colonialism. And so to move away from that, we need to create something different. One thing that I would add to it, though, is that this third space, when created, has to be where Africans operate from an empowered position, where we influence the narratives about us to counter essentially what stories others have told about us. So with this in mind, when framing and thinking about the lessons at African studies as a discipline, as a space, or as a physical manifestation of this third space, there are some ideas or hopes essentially that I provide from my lessons from the North-South partnerships that might be of value for African studies. So I'll talk through 3 of them right now, and then we'll be able to start having a bit of a conversation. The first one is that it's an encouragement for African studies to continue to leverage critical frameworks. A lot of people already use some of these post-colonial critical frameworks in their work to discuss African issues. And these critical frameworks should continue then to also account for that legacy of colonization. To engage with African work, I say, is to engage essentially with the ugly parts of history and the trauma that the continent engages with daily. You cannot talk about the continent without acknowledging those dark moments. And through scholarship advocacy and engagement, African studies can facilitate opportunities to correct misrepresentations or misunderstandings about the continent, especially those misrepresentations that do not name the legacy of colonization and how it continues now to influence global relations. African studies has the potential then to also contribute to challenging the narratives that continue to focus on where Africa lacks in comparison to the West and other. I think those who are more pragmatic will say, well, but there are some things that we are just not doing well. Granted, yes, I think it's not one or the other, but I do think there's an opportunity to spotlight more of the vibrant energies and achievements that Africa has been able to achieve in spite of this colonial trauma. I'm really drawn to Dayo Olopade's The Bright Continent, because in reading it, it provides that initial idea of judging Africa on African terms. Because to set the ruler on Western terms with no acknowledgement, of course, of the history and legacy of colonization, Africa is always going to fall short. These systems were not created, or created rather, to suppress the continent and not to uplift it. And so to then judge us on the same peg without taking into account the rest of the history that has come into getting us to this point, then is not necessarily a fair starting point. So at the institutional level, third spaces could involve hosting seminars like this that engage with topics of relevance to Africa and African countries, to fill the space, to occupy the space and the time with African perspectives and knowledges, where allies and collaborators can then come in and identify synergies from which to develop deeper engagements on Africa, primarily led by Africans. Other ways then are also to celebrate African heritage and culture and ways of doing and knowing through workshops or showcases in and around campus. I'm very much aware that this already happens. But the idea then to also advocate and move from just these external showcases to actually including teaching and learning activities that center, focus on, and include Africa and African knowledges. It is within the classroom spaces that knowledge is created, produced, and transferred, and knowledge creators of the future are trained. So to already start with having more African texts, more African conversations, representation, will ensure then that knowledge is thought of as being inclusive of the African experience as well. The other suggestion is amplifying the African in African studies. It'll become more clear as I keep talking, but essentially the field can continue to support the telling and documenting and dissemination of African stories by Africans. And I argue then that this storytelling should be valued not only when it occurs in academic scholarship, right? So not all writers are writing in articles, or at least in articles that are making it to Western audiences. But in thinking about amplifying scholarship that is expressed through poetry, through music, through dance, and the many other ways in which knowledge is shared within African spaces. Indigenous knowledges, as we're all aware, are often missed or undervalued because they're not always documented. And it's how the legacy of colonization then continues to dictate the primacy of written text or written language over oral knowledge. So our role within an African studies discipline or space is to document that knowledge, both as a way of preserving it for different cultures and future generations, but also in that process, it's a way to re-educate ourselves and others about our African identities and our connections to the continent. But beyond attending to that history, work in, on, and about Africa needs to put forward efforts towards reclaiming the memories and telling of our own stories about the continent, both before colonization and then also beyond when we move through this trauma of colonization. Through our works, we have the power to reclaim our stories and to shape the narrative about the continent and her people. And when thinking about partnerships, these then need to be focused on supporting initiatives that move towards this goal, right? Ultimately, when I think about, especially with grants, is what is the tangible item or object that will come out of this that will allow for the legacy of what we've done to remain beyond that moment. And so when thinking about that then as well with partnerships is what is that legacy contribution that we will make that will allow for African knowledges to be amplified even beyond when the partnership ends. Finally, while it has been very clear that I'm very much a nativist in my thinking, right? African stories should be told by African people. I am also aware that there are many allies who are committed to the continent and to the needs and the goals of Africa. Allies then essentially are crucial, especially in a knowledge economy that doesn't necessarily always provide space for the subaltern to come and speak. Continuous engagement with allies will ensure that African voices and indigenous knowledges are prioritized in the work that is conducted by allies, but also that collaboration is encouraged. So allies work more in tandem with African peers in producing knowledge about Africa. African studies needs allies who understand their own positionality and choose to use it to further the agendas of their African collaborators versus imposing their own preconceived notions of what it should be. And some of this includes just creating safe spaces to allow African voices to speak on issues that pertain to them. African studies needs allies who acknowledge that African people have always been producing knowledge and continue to do so, despite limited representation in mainstream knowledge spaces, right? The absence of it in the journal that you typically read does not mean that that knowledge doesn't exist elsewhere. African studies needs allies who recognize the brilliance of their African peers and respect that they just might know more about their own countries and cultures than they do. And these kinds of allies are crucial as they keep Africa active and known within these exclusive knowledge production spaces. But there also lies an opportunity to move from allies into partners and collaborators, where allies they work in partnership with local researchers in creating and sharing that knowledge. My ultimate wish would be that one day all work on Africa will have an African as a co-author. Because to do otherwise risks speaking for Africa and her people. So I'll stop there. Ultimately, my vision of African studies as the broad study of Africa and her diverse people is not exhaustive, but North-South Partnerships provided, at least for me, a tangible reminder that we still operate in a very, very inequitable knowledge economy. And so as we move towards transforming that, how do we ensure that African knowledges are valued, accurately reflected, and not just outside there, but also amongst ourselves, because we tend to then also take in a lot of those imperial notions that we are not necessarily knowledge producers or good enough ourselves, with the hope then that we can start to change the narrative and tone about the continent and about ourselves within all knowledge production spaces, be it in the classroom or the communities that we're in. Thank you.
Yeukai, thank you so much. And I also am very grateful that you left us about 20 minutes to discuss. So I have about 25 questions I'd like to start with, but I'm going to start by being quiet and ask anyone who is interested to please either raise your hand or you can put any questions you have in the chat. And we have about 20 minutes. Jackie, please, just a second, there we go, please.
Thank you so much for this amazing, amazing talk. I have, like Nancy, have lots of questions and thoughts, and I will limit them because I don't know where to really begin. I really like when you were saying, emphasizing the African and African studies. What's the solution for incorporating more African voices and experiences, let's say at the university level, when one has to navigate sort of, where one can hire someone, all of these obstacles and so on. If you get what I'm saying, like how do we, like, what's the solution, and because it's, visa issue, passport issues, whereas some other countries, it's easier to hire someone, for example, in China, whereas bringing someone over from Africa seems to be more of a obstacle. If you could just, expand more on your thoughts on that issue. I have more to say, but I will email you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Perfect question, because I'm literally dealing with all of that in my current work, right? This administrative role requires me to think a little bit differently. So when I first came to my job, I think I was the first African that they hired. And my pathway, of course, came from grad school. So, my ability to navigate being in higher education institutions is a little bit different on the visa issues. But there was almost this notion that, oh, we can't find people. And that tends to be the narrative, essentially, when I call them stock narratives, and I've written about that in my dissertation, is people create narratives about how to explain that they're not trying hard enough, is essentially how I see it. Because just in the time that I've been in this position, I've been able to find, I think my team now is fully, maybe like 60% African, with or African adjacent, so diasporic individuals. Because my notion was, if we're serving African students, you need to have the right people in the room who understand where these students are coming from. The challenge, I think, is in the connections and finding people who already have found their way to this country in a way that allows for that paperwork component to happen. In the absence of that, what we've then done with a lot of the work that we're doing is created vendors who may not necessarily be based in the US, but we are able to work with them on certain projects and then pay them from wherever they are. So currently, maybe we have provided 30 to 40 opportunities for young people on the continent where they don't have to be in the US to do that work. And so I think it's just thinking more creatively about the kinds of work that it is that you're doing. What are the opportunities to leverage individuals to do things differently? Sometimes it is just creating a space like this where I can come on and have a conversation and there is some honorarium that's provided, right? Like for a typical person like me wouldn't matter, but for individuals on the continent, that's an opportunity to create employment in some way, but also to provide them a space to be part of the conversation and building whatever it is that you're building. I do think the visa issues will always continue to be a challenge, but I am of the belief that there are enough people who've already made it here, who are in a position to be in that job or in these spaces, that to not have representation, even if it's one person, is almost inexcusable, because I think there is the ability to make it possible, given how many Africans have already migrated to the US and are living here under different circumstances. The other thing then that I tend to do is also then work with the grad students or students when they are here. So they are in a capacity to occupy those positions because their visa status allows it. And then notion really is just to make sure that their voices are in the spaces that they typically wouldn't be in, even if it's for a short period of time, even if it is just for 20 hours. So I would say ultimately it's just rethinking the commitment to it, but also thinking a little bit more creatively about what it means to include voices, even if the structures and systems may not allow you to include them in the ways that are like typical hiring processes, but there are ways to include those voices in the building of the things that you're doing regardless.
Thank you for this really important work. Thank you.
Aliko, please.
Unmute myself. Thank you, thank you so very much for such an engaging and thoughtful presentation. It's something that's really needed. As you know, I want to talk about the third spaces that you've been discussing. As you know, one of the those third spaces today is the Atelier de la Pensée, which means workshops of thought, organized by Felwine Sarr and Achille Mbembe, and that so far I think it's mostly taken place in Senegal. And it brings together African intellectuals to discuss a variety of African problems beyond the post-colonial. But to my mind, the effort is fraught with some perennial issues that make it difficult for Africans to not only to think, but also to disseminate their thought. And one of those is language. For the most part, this is done among Francophones. There are few Anglophones, but there are very few. And I don't know if there's much of an exchange once the works have been published. And speaking of the question of language, this defeats Ngugi's wishes of having things done in African languages. There are 2,000 of them. So we remain within the confines of the colonial languages, whether it's English or French, it doesn't really matter. The second issue, as I see it, is one of ageism. As you know, Africa is young. I mean, 60%, maybe even more, among Africans are 35 years or younger than that, and it's going to get worse or better, depending on your perspective. And the third issue, as I see it, is the near absence of institutions within which to disseminate those powerful thoughts. And I was wondering if you have thoughts about these issues.
A lot of elements, but I will try. So I heard language, I'll address that, age, and then maybe just clarify on the institutions. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, at least in Francophone countries, you may have all these thoughts, but when you go actually to teach them in universities, the universities are still made in the model of French universities. I was once in an African university, and they absolutely refused to teach Francophone African texts. You have to begin with, French philosophy and French literature, and first get your first degree there, and then you can study African literature.
Yeah, okay, understood. The language part, yes. So I will own up to where I sit within this post-colonial, decolonial spectrum. Right, they're all intertwined, but I sit more so on the post-colonial side for a number of reasons. Probably my own immaturity, not to be able to understand how a decolonial system could work currently. Does not mean that it is impossible. I just have not been able to wrap my head around what that means to be a different system other than what we have right now. And so I'm very much of how do we work within the system that we have to start to infuse or think through differently. So Homi Bhabha's falls on the decolonial spectrum, but I like it because there is a pragmatism that could be pulled out of it, at least from my own understanding, that I could pull out and say, okay, I can understand what it means to create a third space, to create a space for new thinking and new engagement and new conversations and new knowledge creation that is in essence still operating within the structures, but is trying in its best within that space to fight it or to think differently. So that's my caveat. The language part with Ngugi, I think, is an amazing aspiration because, I mean, even today's, I'll plug it later, but he still does a lot of his conversations in English because he understands that's how he can reach more audience, right? Like engage in these conversations more deeply. But there is that value add in being able to say, listen, I'm only going to write in my home language. And in Decolonizing the Mind, he kind of talks about how when theater was created, or when they started to move to writing some of these plays in Kikuyu, the language defined the audience and the audience defined the language, meaning I am writing for my people. If you can't understand it, this is not meant for you. And vice versa, because I'm writing for my people, I must write in the language that they understand so that it engages with them in the way that would resonate for the realities that they live. And so I love that. I think I love the spirit of it. I do think it's a challenge when we are working in higher education institutions where our engagements or reward systems are predicated on being able to be judged by your peers, right? And if your peers mostly speak English, then you must therefore write in English for them to then be able to judge you to determine that you've reached a level of acceptable excellence, I suppose, to be promoted. So the language issue is always going to be the same. I do think there's an opportunity to leverage language in our own smaller communities, right? So there are things that you know, Aliko, that you in your own space could say, I'm going to go and talk about these kinds of concepts to help people understand how society in itself is unequal and what does that actually mean for us to be thinking about moving and making moves for ourselves. Same thing with me, I speak Shona. I could do that in my same small communities to move the needle a little bit more. I don't anticipate the world is going to change in one day. We have been colonized for centuries and still continuing with these neoliberal sort of avenues. But there's small ways that we can contribute within our small communities in terms of language. So how I think about it too is kind of to Ngugi's term is if I am trying to build a case within a community that is close to me, it doesn't matter if the whole world understands or is able to get the message. I've made a contribution to at least one other person, and hopefully that one other person can pay it forward to the next person. And that's how we kind of spread information, essentially. So I don't think there's a solution in terms of how Africa as a whole can come to conversations outside of the colonial languages of French and English. I do hear this participation thing on the French, Francophone, Anglophone components, and that definitely is still a colonial legacy, right? Like we were, in essence, have adopted sort of these personas of we belong to certain camps because of the language that we use. And through language, like I said before, culture is created and perceptions and all of those things. And so maybe it is in our realm then, to your point about age, as younger scholars, me included, to maybe then leverage our own engagements and our understanding that is different, where it allows for French and English speaking individuals to engage. One thing that I've had to do personally is I am now starting to learn French, because when I've traveled to a lot of different countries that are still Anglophone primarily, but with a lot of the young people who speak French who happen to be there, it seems really unfair that I'm still continuing to expect them to speak in English where I cannot understand French, and there is no kind of push for me to do that either. So on a personal level, I'm doing that. And so then the question is, what are the things that we can do individually that allow us to engage more deeply in conversation about the things that are important to us to move the needle a little bit forward? The age thing, we are the future, the end. Africa is young. And like I said, the work that I do primarily works with that kind of 35 and under age group, because that's who Mastercard Foundation is kind of funding and supporting, with the notion though that this is going to continue to be the age bubble. And I would say to get better, because with age there's innovation and other things that the continent needs to be thinking about leaping in ways that the West is not necessarily always going to be. I think they'll give just enough, but never enough to actually get us to a point where we thrive. That's my personal opinion. People can take it up with me elsewhere. And so how do we ourselves start to think about what it means to thrive within the resources that we have, or the realities of that, what we're facing? So I don't know if, as you asked the question, I'm not actually sure that the age thing is a problem. Perhaps maybe it's age when you think about who's still continuing to be the professors within our higher education institutions, who is providing learning, who is considered somebody who can educate. And those are cultural things that we still have, right? Like there's this assumption that wisdom and age are intertwined. And so the young people are always having to be in a position to learn. But I also come from a culture where age and I suppose status is predetermines age, meaning I have cousins who are 5 years old, but are my young mothers, right? So as they go older, even if they're younger, if they say something, there's still a requirement for me to pay attention and to listen to them in that capacity. So how do we start to reshape what it means to be age versus the cultural kind of relationships that we already have that allow for that reciprocal respect regardless of age? Maybe I'm reaching, but I do not see the age problem. Actually, I see there's an opportunity there because as you and I continue to sort of learn these things and think differently about engaging with the global South, global North kinds of engagements, we are the people who are now in these rooms who can navigate things a little bit differently or require different things, even if they may not necessarily be a full-on blessing from those who are older than us who may have a very different perspective. In terms of institutions, as I mentioned before, I think that was an awakening that I had to come to because I did study philosophy in undergrad, and I definitely was not introduced to any, not ever, an African writer in that class, or even to ever think about African literature as philosophy. And so that's an awakening that I had to come to. But now in my own capacity, when I teach my own courses, I then make sure that they're African writers, African perspectives, and not just African because of my identity, but a whole host of different knowledge genres that I bring into the space, because I want to ensure that my students, by the time they leave, recognize that there are other ways of knowing, and it is okay to know in a different way and to take that up and to want to push in that direction, even if it may be counter to what the mainstream sort of conversations would be. I know that when I was taking on postcolonial work, I was warned by a few people too that this is not the pathway that you want to go. It's a little bit dangerous because it's sort of always aggressive in its calling out of inequalities. And that doesn't tend to work well in, I guess, some mainstream spaces. And I still took it on anyway, because my affiliation to the work, it resonated with me more than sort of these mainstream conversations, because I knew that there was something else out there. And so I think for students, there is within these institutions an opportunity for us ourselves to lead our own learning. The professors are in African institutions, for the most part, have been doing this for the same few years. They learned this is what makes sense. And fundamentally, I do think there's a value in learning the very Western kind of notions, because anywhere else you go, that tends to permeate. So to be able to yourself understand it and then counter it, but to counter it, you have to understand it. So I think there's a value in learning it anyway, but how do we take ownership of our own learning to say, what are the other things then that I can go and read that will allow me to understand the world in a very different way for those who may not have professors like myself who will make sure that those conversations are coming into your learning. So I'm more of a very like ownership-based person in that sense, in the absence of, with the internet and all the other resources that are available, it is also another sort of inexcusable component to say, well, this is all that I've been taught and this is all that I know. Ignorance, willful ignorance is intolerable, at least by my standards. So I don't know if that answered your questions, but it's certainly like has given me additional things to go and think through as well as I continue some of this work.
Thank you, Yeukai. And Aliko added in the notes, age is a political problem. Old people run governments and do everything to perpetuate their power. a political revolution is needed. I recognize that we are almost at time and some people will have to leave. However, there were 2 questions in the Q&A section that I'd like to pose to you, Yeukai, So Upenyu, currently at Michigan State University, Upenyu Maji, asked 2 questions. One, what are some of the possibilities you've seen in your work with the Mastercard Foundation or elsewhere for tinkering with or even pushing back against funder priorities that may not be in the best interest of the populations and communities being served? Number 2, how would you respond to someone who says working for NorthSouth Partnerships in your current capacity, or his with the Ubuntu Dialogues Project, is a form of legitimizing the very systems we love to critique? Chris McCormick asks, relatedly, are there any universities or programs that you think are doing well with your idea of connecting African scholars with non-African scholars in the US or Europe to produce content?
All right, Upenyu, that sounds like someone close to my heart by name, but maybe I'll start with the Mastercard possibilities. So more recently, I would say in the past, I would probably have criticized Mastercard a lot more. It is my job, so I can't really fully say that, but I think there has been an active effort to start to think through what their own role is in perpetuating some of these very unequal engagements with African countries and the young people. The book Decolonizing Wealth is really written by an indigenous administrator, I guess, from the US. But that's been a book that's been driving a lot of Mastercard Foundation's new thinking about how to engage, especially with this new Young Africa Work strategy. And the notion was they learned clearly that before they were sort of determining what the funding priorities would be based off of what they thought they should be funding. And now there's more of an active role in trying to go and actually engage with young people, with governments of these countries to determine what their priorities are, and now moving towards funding priorities in each of these countries based off of what was provided to them. And so they spent about 2 years sort of doing a lot of the listening and workshopping, and then together with the governments and the young people in those countries came up with priority areas for what does it look like for economic development to happen, what industries would you want us to support. So I would say that's a good idea, right? Or a good model to say, pay attention, ask questions, listen. There are always people who live those realities who know best what they need, right? I've done a lot of work with some of the UN, and one big part was we tend to just go in and say education should be implemented this way, but tend to not even ask the teachers who are in these rural schools where there's not a lot of resources, how they're managing, what it is that they would need that would allow them to do better at what they're able to do within that space. And so in just listening more, we were able to sort of come up with solutions that fit the things that they needed in a collaborative manner. By the end of it, it was something that they had provided as, if you did this, this would make it easier for me to do my job, and therefore make it easier for me to ensure that, you know, young people are learning and all the educational outcomes come out of it. So I think we tend to assume that the people who we are trying to support do not have opinions about how to solve things themselves, right? Absent just resources, most people already know what the solutions are to their problems if the resources were available. So that listening model that Mastercard has now started to do is a good direction to move forward. It probably will have its own pitfalls, but at least the starting part of having the conversations and letting someone else tell you what it is that they need would be a really, really good model for a lot of funders. In terms of the criticism about the work, I had to think very deeply about that. And one thing that someone told me was, you do not want to remove yourself from a conversation because the alternative of you not being present, oh, sorry, Upenyu. The alternative of you not being present actually might have worse implications. So be present in the room so you can at least speak up for the moments where things might be going in a direction that you at your own ethical kind of stance think is deficit for the reflection of the continent. Another example that I have, a personal one, was in some of the work that I've done, engaging with groups of African partners, this sort of conversation around can Africans go and do the same data collection? Why should we just not get a team from the US to go and do that? And then me being in the room was the ability for me to call it out for what it was, and then to take it on and say, they're definitely capable. And so kind of these deficit narratives are not something that we're going to entertain at this table, at least if I'm in the room. And so moving away from that, and ultimately it ended up being an African-led and African-run project where we literally just provided the guidelines and the resources to say, go and do the work yourselves. And now from that, all of the people who were trained to do this are now training others or doing work in different places on different projects because they were capable. It was just the absence of resources to get them started. So I think your presence in these spaces is meant to be there to call out inequalities or misrepresentations of the continent, because if you were not there, the likelihood of that exploitation or that deficit narrative continuing is 100% higher than if you are in the room and able to point people in a different direction. In terms of universities or programs that are doing well, from the northern side, I don't know. I think I wouldn't say institutions per se. I think individual faculty or individuals who are part of these institutions, so maybe let me give credit there, is that I think there are people who recognize that there is a need to connect differently, to bring people into the room who understand the partner and want to work more closely with them, but also within that understand that it should be a win-win situation. I know that in my own work, the struggle is usually that I'm kind of torn between my commitment to the continent and the institutional structures that exist that kind of require me to work in a certain way. And so what I've had to do is sort of have more candid conversations on the institutional side to say, hey, this is what this activity or absence of is doing to the people who, if I were in that space, this is how it would impact me. And so those conversations are starting then to allow for institutions on my end to sort of change some of their structures or their systems in a way that ensures that the partners that we work with also win out of the process, right? So I don't know if there are institutions all around that are doing well, because I think our institutions, especially in the US, are rigid in their way that they operate. But I think the individuals sitting in some of these spaces have been doing a lot to at least raise the alarm when things are not going well. And yeah, in terms of connecting African scholars with non-African scholars in the Europe, yeah, I don't think that's been happening. At least when I was looking through some of the journals before this, I was hoping to provide a spread of just to understand how many Africans are actually published in them. And luckily, there's a lot more Africans who are being published in African studies journals. But the tendency then sometimes is still that there's a lot of the funder gives money to say Nancy then comes and writes the article, and Nancy then gets the praise, but kind of disregards all the people who supported her in getting the data that she needed to do her work. And so I don't think that's an institutional charge. I think that's an individual faculty or scholar ethical charge to just be thinking a little bit differently about how you're engaging with those who you claim to be writing on behalf of. And even just the concept of writing on behalf of in itself has its own nasty ring to it. I myself know that I even have to acknowledge when I'm doing work on Black women that I myself am choosing then to write on their behalf because they don't have the structures to be able to do it. But acknowledging that, first of all, I think is one part. And then where possible, making sure that they're able to read it or collaborate with them in presenting back the work or being part of the process of disseminating it in some way is the healthy way to say, I know that there's power that I hold, but how do I make sure that they also get the accolades that they need to to share the work that essentially is about them, that I'm just kind of borrowing to talk about for my own game. So.
Dr. Yeukai Mlambo, I want to thank you 1,000 times for a really rich conversation. We have gone over a little bit. I'm so thankful to all of you who were able to stay and hear the end of this. This is video tape, Zoom taped, I don't know what to call it. And so if anyone would like the recording, please let Aaliyah and Dinah know. And thank you all. Yeukai, thank you so much. You have about 17 jobs and so many things that you have to do right now. And I'm really grateful that you gave us this time and this energy and these wonderfully generative insights. We're really grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you.